What's up, y'all? Welcome to Tabletop Bros. Today we're going to be taking a look at my Chaos Knights army. So we recently wrapped up an 8-week Escalation League, and I was able to take first place with my Chaos Knights army. Mostly War Dogs, but I did try using a couple of the Big Knights at times. And while the Big Knights performed overall pretty well, I found that having more models on the table was the best. I even tried out a couple of demons in the form of some Nurglings, in combination with the objective secured enhancement, so I had something to camp my home objective. But in the end, I found that the restrictions affiliated with the demons made it so that it just made more sense to take more War Dogs. So this was my final list. We started off at 500 points and worked our way up to a full 2,000 points. And my final list for the 2,000 points that I was able to win my last game against Thousand Suns was a total of 13 different War Dogs. As you can see, unfortunately, I didn't quite get everything painted up, but I have the majority of them at least painted to a tabletop standard. My goal when it's all said and done is to have 3 of them painted to each of the various gods. So we have red for Khorne, we have blue for Thousand Suns, we have green for Nurgle, and then we have our purplish pink for Slaanesh. And then I'm probably going to have the leader of my army distinguished with like a black paint job as sort of like an undivided leader. I will obviously go through and do some pretty cool basing on them as well. I've done quite a bit of magnetization on these, so I have the ability to swap out some of the various configurations, which is actually going to be pretty nice because in the recent Munitorum Field Manual, we did see some points changes, and I want to have the flexibility to be able to swap some of the weapons in the future as points are adjusted. We also saw some recent changes to the Chaos Knights army rule, which are pretty nice, so we're going to talk a little bit about them. I'm going to talk about the various roles of the different Chaos Knights, why I chose Chaos instead of Imperial, and then some of the reasons that the Chaos Knights are better and some of the reasons that the Chaos Knights are worse. So that being said, let's go ahead and run down through the Chaos Knights army rule. We'll talk about the changes a little bit, and then we'll talk about the detachment, which we also have a new detachment, but I'm not going to lean in on that one as it would vastly change the composition of the army. And then we'll talk a little bit about the enhancements and stratagems, the ones that I use the most, the ones that weren't really all that useful, and just kind of wrap it up from there. So getting started with the Chaos Knights army rule, we did recently see some massive changes to the army rule, which is actually a really good buff for Chaos Knights, but the army rule itself is Harbingers of Dread. If your army faction is Chaos Knights, each model from your army with this ability has the following Dread abilities. So previously, the way these were worded, the first Dread ability was active in the beginning of the game, and then the second Dread ability activated on turn 3. Now both of these Dread abilities are active the entire game, which means you're going to get the buffs that you would normally only get for turn 3, 4, and 5 throughout the entire game alongside the previous buffs that you got for the entire game. So pretty big buff. So first we have the Despair Aura, which is while enemy units are within 12 inches of this model, each time that enemy unit takes a Battle Shock test or Leadership test, subtract 1 from the result. So Battle Shock has definitely been one of those things that's been sort of contentious throughout this edition. A lot of people have found that it's a little bit underpowered, and there's definitely instances or certain matchups where I felt like this was the case. But with the additional -1 and the 12-inch range on this Despair Aura, and then various different factions having lower or higher leadership tests, it was rather swingy. And then we have the Doom and Darkness ability, which used to be only active for turns 3, 4, and 5, is now active all the time. And there's 2 bullet points here. Each time this model makes an attack, if the target is battle shocked, add 1 to the wound roll. And each time an attack targets this model, if the attacking model unit is battle shocked, subtract 1 from the hit roll. So essentially the goal of the Chaos Knights army rule is to get your opponent battle shocked with as many units as possible, which is very strong in 2 senses. The first sense is they will have 0 OC, which means they're going to have trouble holding objectives, which is already very difficult against Chaos Knights as each of the War Dogs has a OC of 8. So usually if I have 1, especially if I have 2 or more standing on objective, it's almost impossible for somebody to take it from me. And then the second main part of the ability is if something is battle shocked, you can't target it with stratagems. So whether you're looking for a defensive stratagem so you don't die, or offensive stratagem so you kill me better, if your unit's battle shocked, it's not an option, which can definitely make something swingy. If someone is expecting to be able to use a stratagem and then is suddenly battle shocked, this can throw a real wrench in the works. And then stacking these battle shock buffs, taking away OC, and then also the ability to use stratagems with +1 to wound against battle shock units, or subtracting 1 from the hit roll if they're targeting my unit from a battle shocked unit, definitely can make the game massively swingy. And I think had these new rules been in effect, had both of these Harbingers of Dread abilities been in effect, the army would have been substantially stronger. So we did have an 8-week league total. I lost one of my games early on, my second game to be exact, but I ended up winning all 7 of my other games, and most of them I won pretty handily on points. The fact of the matter is, this army is extremely powerful for holding objectives. It's extremely aggressive and puts a ton of pressure on your opponent. With this many models, 13 total units, it's pretty good at scoring secondaries, especially because there's only a couple of secondaries that require you to do an action. And then some of the various missions that could be selected, which obviously I had no control over. have specific benefits to battle line units, and all 13 of my units are in fact battle line. So now let's take a look at the detachment rule. So the Chaos Knight's only detachment at the time of the league was the Traitor's Lance. And the detachment rule for the Traitor's Lance is called Forged in Terror Aura. And this is very powerful. In the Battle Shock step of your opponent's command phase, if an enemy unit that is below its starting strength is within 12 inches of a Chaos Knight model from your army, that enemy unit must take a Battle Shock test. For the purpose of this ability, if the unit has a starting strength of 1, it is considered to be below its starting strength while it has lost 1 or more wounds. So the very important distinction on this rule is that it just has to be below its starting strength. That means that if you have a unit of 10 models or 5 models, all I have to do is kill one of those models and you're below your starting strength. Or if you have a vehicle or character model and it's lost 1 or more wounds, it's below its starting strength. So the way that you're able to benefit from this rule the most is you basically want to plink some damage on as many various units as possible. Either doing 1 damage to a vehicle or character, or killing at least 1 model from every unit. And then you want to get your units as many as possible within 12 inches of as many as possible of their units, which plays directly into the strengths of the Chaos Knights, because what I like to do is put as much pressure as possible on my opponent, get some of my units up in their face, up in combat, and then sit on all of the primary objectives, run up the scoreboard, and then score my secondaries where applicable. So next we have our 4 enhancements, and overall for most games I only took 1 or I tried out like 2 of the enhancements. One of them was pretty powerful, but to tell you the truth, I could have done without any of them. So the first enhancement is Lord of Dread. Chaos Knights model only. At the start of the fight phase, you can select an enemy unit within engagement range of the bearer. That enemy unit must take a Battle Shock test. So this isn't bad. It's at the start of the fight phase. The other Battle Shock procs in their command phase. So I'm already forcing a Battle Shock test at -1 in their command phase regardless. This just gives me the ability to force it on my turn at the beginning of the fight phase, which could potentially stop them from using a stratagem or giving me one more opportunity to Battle Shock them. But then they're going to reproc that Battle Shock at the beginning of the command phase, so it's not really going to affect scoring. And because previously the second part of the actual army rule wasn't active until the 3rd turn, it meant that for the 1st and 2nd turn, this wasn't really that useful, because it wasn't going to be getting the +1 to wound or -1 to be hit rule until turns 3, 4, and 5. But I think now, with the new changes to the army rule, I could definitely see a place for Lord of Dread. Next we have the Aura of Terror, and I found this to be the one that I was taking every game. Chaos Knights model only. If you control an objective marker at the end of your command phase and the bearer is within range of that objective marker is said to be tainted and it remains under your control until your opponent's level of control over the objective marker is greater than yours at the end of the phase. In addition, while an objective marker is tainted and under your control, the objective marker has the Despair of Dread ability as if it was a Chaos Knight model from your army. So essentially this is just objective secured. So this is more beneficial in the later turns of the game, as once your opponent no longer has the ability to pick units up or come in from deep strike, you can leave your home objective unattended and it stays under your control. So as you're running lower on resources later in the game, you don't have to have one of the knights sitting back on an objective. I also use this in combination with some Nurgling units in some of my earlier games, because the Nurglings have OC 0, so I was basically objective securing my home objective, leaving my Nurglings behind to just sit on it, and then moving off to use my knights for something else. I do think this is a powerful ability, but to tell you the truth, with some of the long-range shooting knights, and the majority of the time having the ability to still see a target or just not shoot with them, I probably could have gone without it. But I think overall it is definitely a strong ability, and I think it's the best of the enhancements. Next we have the Traitor's Mark. Chaos Knights model only. In your movement phase, select an enemy unit within 12 inches of the bearer. That enemy unit must take a Battle Shock test. So this one is pretty good. Most of the knights move pretty quickly, so being able to get within 12 inches of a unit and then force a Battle Shock test is definitely nice. But again, because it's in your movement phase and you have the ability to move and then force this Battle Shock test, I can essentially get like up to a 26-inch range with it, assuming that I didn't even advance. And if something gets Battle Shocked, I can potentially turn off their strats. But again, you're going to retech for a Battle Shock in your opponent's command phase, so you're not actually really affecting the score. And for the most part, while it is nice to turn off strats for your opponent, in the end, winning games is all about scoring. And then the final enhancement is the Penopoly of the Cursed Knights. So Chaos Knight model only. Each time an attack is made against the bearer, subtract 1 from the armor penetration characteristic of that attack. So this one's not bad, but realistically, it's not that important on Armigers. I did run it a couple of games on a big knight, which was pretty nice, because with a 3-up save, essentially getting cover typically on a big knight is not that difficult, as you just have to obscure part of the model. So you're essentially ignoring the first 2 points of AP. It's also really good in combat, as most combat weapons have -2 AP, and the knights don't have an invulnerable save in combat, so instead of taking saves at like 5-up, you're usually taking them at 4-up. which is pretty nice. And then also for shooting attacks, most things are coming in at 3 AP. If you have cover and then this enhancement, it takes it to 1 AP, which puts you on a 4-up save. So it saves you from having to spend a command point to proc the 4-up invulnerable save from shooting instead of your normal 5-up. It is worth note, obviously, that because these are enhancements, they can only go on characters, which means you can only put them on big knights or character small knights. So next we have our stratagems, and there are 6 total stratagems that you can choose from. And to tell you the truth, there was really just one that I used more than any. I used a couple of them at different times, and they're definitely nice to have, but one of them is an absolute necessity. So the first stratagem is Dreadhounds, and I did find that this one is fairly useful because I was running all War Dogs. So Dreadhounds, 1 command point, start of your shooting phase or start of the fight phase. Target 2 or more War Dog units from your army and 1 enemy unit that is eligible target for each of those selected War Dogs. Until the end of the phase, the selected War Dog units can only target that enemy unit, but all weapons equipped by those War Dog models gain the Sustained Hits 1 ability. In addition, if the enemy unit is battle shocked until the end of the phase, each time a selected War Dog model makes an attack against the enemy unit, an unmodified hit roll of 5 scores a critical hit. Alright, so this is very powerful in an army with 13 War Dogs. More often than not, if I was shooting at something, I would identify the top target, whatever I wanted to kill the most, and then I would pick like 3 or 4 different War Dogs, whether it was shooting or combat. Now these War Dogs are restricted so they can only target this unit, but essentially it guarantees that I'm going to kill it. So I used this in my final game against Magnus with 3 War Dogs in combat, all of which gain sustained hits, and they're able to dish out a massive amount of damage. There was a couple times when I used it in shooting as well to target a big tank or big monster, but essentially granting 2 or more units sustained hits 1 is very powerful, as you're essentially upping your damage output by about 15%. The second stratagem that I used a decent amount was Terror Shades, 1 command point. Any phase just after an enemy unit fails a battle shock test. Target 1 Chaos Knight unit from your army within 12 of that enemy unit. Roll 6d6 for each 4-up. That enemy unit suffers 1 mortal wound, and the model regains up to 1 lost wound. So I call this the Drain Life strat. Essentially, when something fails a battle shock test within 12, which is probably going to be in my opponent's command phase, because everything within 12 has to take a battle shock test at -1, I then pay a command point, pick that unit, roll 6d6, and then 50% of those, so typically 3 of those, are going to do 1 mortal wound to that unit, and then I'm going to gain back 1 lost wound on my knight. So this is pretty nice, essentially finishing off something that's already wounded, doing a little extra damage to a tough target, but most importantly, being able to heal some wounds to some of my War Dogs. There's nothing worse than somebody getting a War Dog down to like 2 or 3 wounds, and then suddenly it jumps back up to like 5 or 6. And next we have Disdain for the Weak. I used this a couple of times and it wasn't bad, but it's definitely not amazing. So 1 command point, fight phase just after an enemy unit has selected its targets. 1 Chaos Knight unit from your army that was selected as a target of 1 or more attacking units' attacks. Until the end of the phase, your model has a Feel No Pain 6-up ability and a Feel No Pain 5-up ability against attacks made by battle shocked models. So Feel No Pain 6-up is not all that good. I did use it a couple of times on my big knight and it was kind of nice, but overall not particularly amazing. Now if your opponent's unit is battle shocked, you're going to be shrugging off 33% of the damage, which is pretty good. But to tell you the truth, it's better on paper than it actually is in application. And next we have a Long Leash, 1 command point. When your command phase, target 1 aberrant model from your army and up to 3 War Dog models from your army. Until the start of your next command phase, these War Dog models count as being within range of any aura abilities that aberrant model has. So I never really used this one. It wasn't particularly amazing just because of like the selection. I only ran 2 big knights throughout the league. And to tell you the truth, this just wasn't really applicable. Next we have Diabolic Bullwork, 1 command point. When your opponent's shooting phase, just after an enemy unit has selected its targets, target 1 Chaos Knight unit from your army that was selected as a target of 1 or more attacking units' attacks. Effect until the end of the phase, Chaos Knight's model has a 4-up invulnerable save against ranged attacks. So I did use this a couple of times on my big knight and a couple of times on a small knight when I was really trying to keep it from dying, but overall it's not really a necessity. With the enhancement that decreases the incoming AP of attacks by 1, most of the time I didn't really need to use this because most things have a -3 modifier. So if I have a 3-up save, I'm in cover and I decrease their AP by 1, it's realistically taking me to a 4-up save anyway. But I found more often than not it wasn't a necessity, especially when I was running the 13 War Dogs. And then last but not least is the undeniable best strat in the Chaos Knights detachment. Knights of Shade, 1 command point. Your movement phase or your charge phase. Target up to 2 War Dog models from your army or 1 Titanic Chaos Knight model from your army. Effect, until the end of the phase, the selected model can move horizontally through models and terrain features as if they were not there. So this is absolutely amazing. You can do this once in your movement phase and then again in your charge phase. And the majority of the turns in the game, I was using this twice. So you can pick either 1 big Chaos Knight or you can pick 2 War Dogs, which is really nice. And then you essentially just move through terrain and models as if they're not there. So very often on the first turn, I would put everything behind walls so I wasn't able to be seen in case my opponent got the first turn. I would use this on 2 models to move just straight through the piece of cover that was in front of them and get behind some more cover or get onto an objective. And then in the charge phase, once again, rather than having to go around a piece of intervening terrain, I was able to just go straight through it. If someone was trying to screen me out with like various models, chaff, etc., I could just charge straight through them. And this is by far the best stratagem in all of the detachment. I spent almost all my command points on Knights of Shade, and it is absolutely phenomenal. And realistically, I think Chaos Knights or any Knights would be substantially worse without access to this, which is part of the reason that the new detachment is cool, but definitely not nearly as good. So that being said, let's check out the data sheets of the Knights in my army. So in my final army, I was running 2 of the War Dog Executioners. So this is your main shooting knight. It has the standard profile for all of the War Dogs. Move of 12, toughness 10, 3-up save, 12 wounds, leadership 7+, and OC 8. So the move of 12 is really nice because these guys can get exactly where they need to be. The OC of 8 is massive, as it's very difficult for my opponent to hold objectives if I have even one knight standing on them. And then realistically, the Armiger list relies on the toughness 10 and 12 wounds with a 3-up, 5-up invulnerable to essentially just stat check your opponents. So each of the War Dogs in this list has its own particular special rule. The Executioner special rule is each time this model makes an attack that targets a unit below half strength, add 1 to the hit roll. So essentially, if I'm trying to finish something off that's already damaged, instead of hitting on 3s, I'm hitting on 2s, which is pretty nice. And then you have 2 weapons on this. 1 is an option and 1 comes standard. You have 2 of the War Dog autocannons coming standard with a 48-inch range, 4 shots each, ballistic skill 3-up, strength 9, AP 1, damage 3. So essentially you have 8 shots with this, hitting on 3s at strength 9. Typically what you're going to be shooting at is going to be in cover, so essentially they're just taking armor saves. But at 3 damage, this is able to do quite a bit of damage to either an individual character model. It's able to pick up things like Space Marines fairly reliably, and it's also able to plink quite a bit of damage on vehicles. And then I also opted for the Demon Breath Melt-A-Gun, which is Melt-A 2, 12-inch range, 1 attack, ballistic skill 3, strength 9, AP 4, D6 damage. So these things are pretty good, and with 2 of them kind of sitting back in the back lines, typically 1 of them is standing on an objective, but more often than not, I would try to get the 2 of these shooting at a single target that I wanted to kill. And next we have the War Dog Stalker. So this guy is the leader of your detachment, and one thing that distinguishes this and makes the all War Dog list very good and applicable for Chaos Knights is the fact that this guy is actually a character. So he still has the battle line keyword, but he also gets the character keyword, which means you can give him enhancements. And because the Imperial Knights don't have access to a Armiger that's a character, you can't actually run an all Armiger list for Imperial Knights, but you can for Chaos Knights. So that means that whenever you're running Imperial Knights, you always have to have one of the big knights. Because you can't make an allied in unit your warlord, and because you can't take an Armiger character, you have no access to a warlord outside of one of the big knights. So that is definitely one of the massive differentiation factors that makes the all Armiger list so good for Chaos Knights and really puts a stat check to your opponent. So once again, the Stalker has a 12-inch move, toughness 10, 3-up save, wounds 12, leadership 7, and then OC 8. He also has a 5-up invulnerable save, and then the Stalker's special ability, each time this model makes an attack that targets an enemy unit, if there are no other units from your opponent's army within 6 inches of that target, add 1 to the wound roll. So this guy's pretty good against isolated targets if there's nothing else within 6, and typically you can shoot with all your other stuff first, save him till last, kill all the stuff that's nearby, and then have this guy attacking at +1 to wound. So you have quite a few different options of what you can arm this guy with. I always opted for the same thing, the Reaper Chain Talon for combat, which has a strike and sweep profile. So you either get 4 attacks with weapon skill 3, strength 10, -3, damage 3, or you get 8 attacks with weapon skill 3, strength 8, -2, damage 1. So he's pretty good in combat with dealing with more durable targets and then also with dealing with some chaff. I didn't take the Slaughter Claw on him, even though it does substantially more damage on the strike profile. The Slaughter Claw doesn't have a sweep profile, which means you can bog him down with a bunch of like light infantry and he can't really kill himself free. Next, you have the option for your big gun, which you can take either the Avenger Chain Cannon or the Demon Breath Spear. The Avenger Chain Cannon is 24-inch range, 12 shots, ballistic skill 3, strength 6, -1 AP, 1 damage. The Demon Breath Spear is Melt-A 4, 24-inch range, attacks 2, ballistic skill 3, strength 12, -4, D6 damage. I always opted for the Demon Breath Spear, as just having a couple of pot shots on him with the potential to get +1 to wound makes his Melt-A pretty good, especially if I get him within 12, because the minimum damage he can do is 5 and the maximum damage he can do with a single shot is 10. And then you have 2 options for his extra weapon. You can either have the Havoc Missile Launcher or the Diabolus Heavy Stubber. We'll talk a little bit more about the Stubber later, but I always opted for the Havoc Missile Launcher. The Havoc Missile Launcher has indirect fire, it has blast, 48-inch range, D6 shots, ballistic skill 3, strength 5, 0 AP, and 1 damage. So the Havoc missile launchers aren't really that good for actually killing something, but if you take a bunch of them, which I did, having the blast profile is really good against big squads of infantry. Having indirect fire is really nice because normally you're hitting on 3s, which means if you can't see the target, it's going to go to 4s. They're always going to get access to cover, but it has no AP anyway, so realistically, something like a Space Marine that already has a 3-up armor save is not going to benefit from this. And with Strength 5, I'm wounding most things on 3s. If I'm shooting something that's not within 6 of another unit, like they're camping their home objective with a solo unit, I'm wounding it typically on 2s. And then I'm just trying to plink off a couple of damage here or there to damage a vehicle or to kill a single infantry model, essentially just trying to proc the below starting strength so I get the full benefits of my rules. And next we have the War Dog Karnivore. So these guys are the massive close combat threat in this army. I took 5 of these. The beauty of them is they have a move of 14 inches, so they have an extra 2-inch move over the rest of the knights. They also don't really have that great of guns, so very often on the first turn, I'm using an advance roll. So realistically, they're moving like 15 to 20 inches, which is pretty freaking fast. They have a toughness 10, 3-up save, 5-up invulnerable save, 12 wounds, leadership 7, and OC 8. Their special ability is the Carnivore rule. You can reroll charge rolls made for this model. And with how fast they are, and then also the Knights of the Shade, moving through intervening models and terrain, rerolling charge rolls is massive. These guys are always surging forward as fast as possible and putting the most pressure on my opponent's units. The only ranged weapon that they're equipped with is going to be that Havoc missile launcher, which I opted for every time over the Diabolic Heavy Stubber. And again, if I was not advancing with them, I was basically just trying to use some indirect fire to plink a couple of wounds off of a unit to just get it below its starting strength. But the biggest differentiation on these instead of the rest of the Chaos Knights is their melee profiles. You get both the Reaper Chain Talon and then also the Slaughter Claw, and then you can choose which one you want to use. But the big differentiation factor is that all of its close combat weapons hit on 2s. All the other knights hit on 3s, so that means that these guys are substantially better in close combat. On top of that, instead of having 4 attacks with the Strike profile or the Slaughter Claw, you get 6 attacks, which is a 50% increase in damage output. And then instead of getting 8 attacks with the Sweep profile, you get 12 attacks instead. So realistically, I was almost always using either the Slaughter Claw, which is 6 attacks hitting on 2s, strength 12, -3, d6 plus 2 damage, or the Reaper Chain Talon Sweep profile, which is 12 attacks hitting on 2s, strength 8, -2, 1 damage. And realistically, there's no instance you would ever use the Strike profile on these guys because you lose 2 strength over the Slaughter Claw, and then instead of doing a flat 3 damage with the Chain Talon, you're doing 3 to 8 damage with the Slaughter Claw. So it's just objectively worse using the Strike profile. These guys are absolutely amazing, and giving them sustained hits on multiples of them against something in combat allowed me to slay Magnus in a single phase, or pretty much take out almost anything else in the game in combat. And then last but not least, we have the War Dog Brigand. So the War Dog Brigand has the move 12, T10, 3-up, 5-up invulnerable, 12 wounds, leadership 7, OC 8. The Brigand special rule is each time this model makes a ranged attack that targets the closest eligible enemy unit, improve the armor penetration characteristic of that attack by 1. So this is extremely good. And then the Brigand is armed with the Avenger Chain Cannon, the Demon Breast Spear, and then I always opted for the Diabolic Heavy Stubber. So the Chain Cannon has a 24-inch range. It has 12 shots hitting on 2s, which again is what makes this guy so good at shooting. All of his shooting profiles hit on 2s, as where all the rest of the Chaos Knights are hitting on 3s in shooting. The Chain Cannon has a strength of 6, AP -1, and damage 1. But realistically, if you're shooting at the closest eligible target, which you want to keep in mind during your movement phase, how to position him so that he can only shoot at what's closest, or you make sure that he can't see stuff that he doesn't want to shoot at, so they're not eligible targets, you're going to be hitting at AP 2. And with 12 shots on average, you're getting 10 hits. With strength 6, you're wounding a lot of stuff on 2s, or most things on 3s. So you're going to be plinking off quite a bit of damage with this guy, one at a time. And then with the Demon Breast Spear, it has Melt of 4, 24-inch range, 2 shots, hitting on 2s, strength 12, -4 AP. But if you're positioned and shooting at the closest target, which is a vehicle or monster, it's -5 AP, which means they're either taking an invulnerable save, or if they don't have an invulnerable save, they're not taking any save at all. And then it's doing a d6 damage, or if you're within 12 inches, which essentially with a move of 12 means anything within 24 inches before you move, you're going to be doing 5 to 10 damage per shot. And then the reason I opted to take the Diabolic Heavy Stubber on this guy is because the Heavy Stubber has Rapid Fire 3, it has 36-inch range, which means if I shoot at something within 18 inches and it's the closest target, it's going to be getting 1 AP. So normally you're getting 3 shots, but with rapid fire you're getting 6. You have a ballistic skill of 2, you have strength 5, 1 AP if it's the closest target, and then 1 damage. So realistically, this guy is dishing out 2 big shots from the Demon Breast Spear, and then 18 shots at something close by, and just plinking off a couple wounds here and there, wounding stuff or finishing stuff off. And again, these guys are extremely good at shooting, but they really lack the ability to kill something in combat. So with 5 Brigands shooting at mid to close range, 5 Carnivores putting pressure on my opponent and slapping in combat, 2 Executioners staying back, standing on objectives and doing some long range damage, and then my 1 Stalker kind of filling the mid battle role or defending my home objective, I definitely found that this list is basically perfect. The Brigands are really good at shooting and doing damage, the Carnivores are really good at combat and doing damage, and realistically the times when I had the most trouble was when my opponent focused down all of one unit or the other. So I either lacked late game close combat or late game shooting, but for the most part I just kind of spread these guys out, rushed straight at my opponent, and just ran away with the primary score. I really like the Chaos Knights army and the way that you run this all War Dogs list. It's super fun, you still get 13 game pieces, everything is just as hard to kill and has just as much OC. The army has a ton of damage output and certain other matchups your opponent just can't deal with this many tough models. 13 units is plenty to have standing on objectives, doing actions, and putting pressure on my opponent. The ability to move through terrain and models means that they can't really move block you. The ability to do mortal wounds when something fails a battle shock test. And then heal is very powerful situationally. And then the ability to pick 2 or more of these in either shooting or combat and then give them all sustained hits 1. Proccing on 5-ups if they target something that's battle shocked is extremely powerful for making sure just one big target dies. I do think the Imperial Knights army rule is a little bit better, but that was prior to the Chaos Knights rule getting a buff. The Imperial Knights having a 6-up Feel No Pain is really strong, a 5-up Feel No Pain once they complete their oath, and typically their oath is going to be to slay your warlord, which is fairly easy to do if you're going all out at it. And then also the buff of getting 3 extra command points when they complete their oath is very strong as well. The Imperial Knights also have the ability to reroll 1 hit roll and 1 wound roll for every activation, which is very powerful and increases their damage output, but they don't have the ability to hit on 2s in combat or 2s in shooting. All of their stuff's going to be hitting on 3s, with the exception of a couple of special rules on some of their knights. The Imperial Knights also don't have access to something like the Carnivore with the extra 2-inch movement and then the 50% increased damage output in combat. So their Warglaives are going to be like the combination of shooting and close combat knight, which means they're only ever going to be getting 4 or 8 attacks. They're never going to be getting the 6 or 12 that the Carnivores have. And then finally, the main drawback of the Imperial Knights, or the main bonus of the Chaos Knights, is the ability to take one of the War Dogs as a character. This means that the Imperial Knights are never going to be able to run all War Dogs. They always have to have one big knight, which at around 400 points apiece is close to like 3 of the Armigers. And realistically, after running a couple of different lists, I found that having just one big Chaos Knight really just draws a bunch of firepower, which is nice because they're not focusing on all the Armigers. But typically my opponent was able to kill it in like one phase, and if not in a single phase, in one turn. So saying goodbye to 400 points all at once was the equivalent of them killing 3 of the smaller knights. And having one of the big knights basically meant that I had 3 less units to move around the board, stand on objectives, or score secondaries with. So overall, I'm really happy with this list, not just because I won the Escalation League, but just overall, it's a ton of fun to play. The majority of your stats are exactly the same on every unit, outside of a couple of units hitting on 2s in shooting or combat, or the extra 2-inch move on the Carnivores. It's super easy to run. My main strategy was to basically just rush forward as fast as possible, stand on objectives, score secondaries, and kill stuff, which is a really fun way to play Warhammer. You don't need to have some crazy strategies. Having access to the Knights of Shade stratagem and being able to move through terrain with 2 of my War Dogs in the movement phase and then also again in the charge phase was extremely powerful. I absolutely love these guys, and so far I'm really enjoying painting them. I'm definitely looking forward to dedicating a little more time to them, getting the rest of the units caught up, and then doing some awesome custom bases. So if you enjoyed today's video and hearing a little bit about the Escalation League, the way that you use the Chaos Knights, or at least the way that I did, my army composition, and overall strategy, hopefully by now Tabletop Bros has earned your subscription. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. We did recently get a new Munitorum field manual. The army rule also got buffed, which I think makes this army even better, especially as some of the more powerful armies got nerfed. We also got a couple of points drops on some of the models, which means realistically there's a way you could fit 14 of these guys in a list, or at least take a couple more enhancements. But if I did decide to go that route, I would have to switch out one of the other knights and take at least one more Stalker, as the Stalkers are the only characters and the only ones eligible to be equipped with enhancements. But yeah, that is it for my Chaos Knights Escalation League army. I did take first place and it was a ton of fun. Not always for my opponents, as sometimes it can definitely be frustrating playing against a stat check army. But for the most part, my opponents knew that they were going to be playing me the following week. So they were able to take a couple of extra units to dish out some dev wounds or some extra big guns to try to take down these bad boys. So yeah, that is it for the Chaos Knights All War Dog Escalation League wrap-up, compositions, tactics, and breakdown video. And that's it from the Tabletop Bros. Later!